Excellencies may, however, readily imagine that the confined regions hitherto unexplored within the limits of the Arctic Circle, although situated directly beneath me, are therefore seen without any appearance of being foreshortened, were still in themselves comparatively too diminutive and at too great a distance from the point of sight to admit any nature of any very accurate examination. Nevertheless, what could be seen was of a nature singular and exciting. Northward from that huge rim before mentioned, and which slight qualification may be called the limit of human discovery in these regions, one unbroken or nearly unbroken sheet of ice continues to extend. In the first few degrees of this progress, its surface is very sensibly flattened, farther on depressed into a plane, and finally becoming not a little concave, it terminates at the pole itself in a single circular center, sharply defined, whose apparent diameter is subtended at a balloon angle of about 65 seconds. And whose dusky hue, varying in intensity, was at all times darker than any other spot upon the visible hemisphere, and occasionally deepened into the most absolute blackness. Farther than this, little could be ascertained. By 12 o'clock, the circular center had materially decreased in circumference. And by 7 p.m., I lost sight of it entirely, the balloon passing over the western limb of the ice and floating away rapidly in the direction of the equator. April 8th. Found a sensible diminution in the Earth's apparent diameter, besides the material alteration in the general color and appearance. The whole visible area partook in different degrees of a tint of a pale yellow, and in some portions had acquired a great brilliancy, even painful to the eye. My view downward was also considerably impeded by the dense atmosphere in the vicinity of the surface being loaded with clouds, between whose masses I could now and then surface being loaded with clouds, between whose masses I could only now and then obtain a glimpse of the earth itself. This difficulty of direct vision had troubled me more or less for the last 48 hours, but my present enormous elevation brought closer together, as it were, the floating bodies of vapor, and the inconvenience became, of course, more and more palpable in proportion to my ascent. Nevertheless, I could easily perceive that the balloon now hovered above the great range of Great Lakes in the continent of North America, and was holding a course due south, which would bring me to the tropics. This circumstance did not fail to give me the most heartfelt satisfaction, and I hailed it as a happy omen of ultimate success. Indeed, the direction I had hitherto taken had filled me with uneasiness, for it was evident that had I continued much longer, there would have been no possibility of arriving at the moon at all. As it may seem, it was only at this late period that I began to understand the great error I had committed, not taking my departure from Earth at some point in the plane of the lunar eclipse. April 9th. Today, the Earth's diameter was greatly diminished, and the color of the surface assumed hourly a deep tint of yellow. The balloon kept steadily on her course to the southward and arrived at 9 p.m. over the southern edge of the Mexican Gulf. April 10th. I was suddenly aroused from slumber at 5 o'clock this morning by a loud cracking and terrific sound for which I could in no manner account. It was of a very brief duration, but while it lasted, it resembled nothing in the world of which I had any previous experience. It is needless to say that I became excessively alarmed, having, in the first instance, attributed the noise to the bursting of the balloon. I had examined all my apparatus, however, with great attention, and could discover nothing out of order. Spent a great part of the day in meditating upon an occurrence so extraordinary, but could find no means whatever of accounting for it. Went to bed dissatisfied in a great state of anxiety and agitation. April 11th. Found a startling diminution of the apparent diameter of Earth, and a considerable increase now observable for the first time, and that of the moon itself. Which wanted only a few days of being full. It now required long and excessive labor to condense within the chamber sufficient atmospheric air for the sustenance of life. April 12th. A singular alteration took place in regard to the direction of the balloon, and although fully anticipated, afforded me the most unequivocal delight. Having reached in its former course about the 20th parallel of the southern latitude, it turned off suddenly in an acute angle to the eastward, and thus proceeded throughout the day, keeping nearly, if not altogether, in the exact plane of the lunar eclipse. What was worthy of remark, a very perceptible vacillation in the car was a consequence of this change of route, a vacillation which prevailed in a more or less degree for a period of many hours. April 13th. Was again very much alarmed by a repetition of the loud cracking noise which terrified me on the 10th. Thought long upon the subject, but was unable to form any satisfactory conclusion. Great decrease in the Earth's apparent diameter, which now subtended from the balloon at an angle of very little more than 25 degrees. The moon could not be seen at all, being very nearly in my zenith. I still continued in the plane of the eclipse, but made little progress to the north, to the eastward. April 14th. Extremely rapid decrease in the diameter of the Earth. Today I became strongly impressed with the idea that the balloon was now actually running up the side of the aft sides up to the point of perigee. In other words, holding the direct course which would bring it immediately to the moon and that part of the orbit into the nearest to the Earth. The moon itself was directly overhead. And consequently hidden from my view, great and long continued labor necessary for the condensation of my atmosphere. April 15th, not even the outlines of the continents and seas could now be traced upon the Earth with distinctness. About 12 o'clock I became aware for the third time of that appalling sound which had so astonished me before. It now, however, continued for some moments, and gathered intensity as it continued. At length, stupefied and terror-stricken, I stood in expectation of I knew not what hideous destruction. The car vibrated with excessive violence, came with the voice of 1,000 thunders, roaring and booming by the balloon. When my fears and astonishment had in some degree subsided, I had little difficulty in supposing it to be some mighty volcanic fragment ejected from that world to which I was so rapidly approaching, and in all probability one of that singular class of substances occasionally picked up on the earth and termed meteoric stones, for want of a better appellation. April 16th. Today, looking upward as well as I could through each of the side windows alternately, I beheld to my great delight a very small portion of the moon's disk protruding, as it were, on all sides beyond the huge circumference of the moon. My agitation was extreme, for I had now little doubt of soon reaching the end of my perilous voyage. Indeed, the labor now required by the condenser had increased to a most oppressive degree, and allowed me scarcely any respite from excursion. Sleep was a matter nearly out of the question. I became quite ill, and from my frame trembled with exhaustion. It was impossible that the human nature could endure this state of intense suffering much longer. During the now brief interval of darkness, a meteoric stone again passed in my vicinity, and the frequency of these phenomena began occasioning me much apprehension. April 17th. This morning proved an epoch on my voyage. It will be remembered that on the 13th, the Earth subtended an angular breadth of 25 degrees, and on the 14th, it had greatly diminished. On the 15th, a still more remarkable decrease was observable, and retiring on the night of the 16th, I noticed an angle of no more than about 7 degrees and 15 minutes. What therefore must have been my amazement on wakening from a brief and disturbed slumber on the morning of this day, the 17th, from a brief and disturbed slumber, at finding the surface beneath me so suddenly and wonderfully augmented in volume, as to subtend no less than 39 degrees in apparent angular diameter, I was thunderstruck. No words can give any adequate idea of the extreme, the absolute horror and astonishment with which I was seized, possessed, and altogether overwhelmed. My knees tottered beneath me, my teeth chattered, and my hair started up on end. The balloon then had actually burst. These were actually the first tumultuous ideas that had hurried through my mind. The balloon had positively burst. I was falling with the most impetuous, the most unparalleled velocity. To judge by the immense distance I had already passed so quickly over. It could not be more than 10 minutes at the farthest before I should reach the surface of the earth and be hurled into annihilation. But at length, reflection came to my relief. I paused, I considered, I began to doubt. The matter was impossible. I could not at any reason have become so rapidly down. Besides, although I was evidently approaching the surface below me, it was with speed by no means commensurate with the velocity I'd had at first conceived. This consideration served to calm the perturbation of my mind, and I had finally succeeded in regarding the phenomena in its proper point of view. In fact, amazement must have been fairly depriving in my senses when I could not see the vast difference in appearance between the surface below me and the surface hidden by the balloon, while the moon itself in all its glory, lay beneath me and at my feet. The stupor and my surprise produced in my mind by this extraordinary change in the posture of affairs was perhaps, after all, that part of the adventure least susceptible of explanation. For the bouleversement in itself was not only natural and inevitable, but had long actually anticipated a circumstance to be expected whenever I should arrive at that exact point of my voyage where the attraction of the planet should be superseded by the attraction of the satellite, or more precisely, where the gravitation of the balloon toward the Earth should be less powerful than its gravitation toward the moon. To be sure, I arose from a sound slumber while all my senses in confusion to the contemplation of a very startling phenomenon, and one already, although expected, was not expected at the moment. The revolution itself must, of course, have taken place in an easy and gradual manner, and it's by no means clear that had I even been awake at the time of the occurrence, I should have been made aware of it by any internal evidence of an inversion. That is to say, by any inconvenience or disarrangement, either about my person or about my apparatus. It is almost needless to say that upon coming to a due sense of my situation and emerging from the terror which had absorbed me in every faculty of my soul, my attention was, in the first place, wholly directed to the contemplation of the general physical appearance of the moon. It lay beneath me like a chart, and although I judged it to be still at no inconsiderable distance, the indentures of its surface were defined by my vision with the most striking and altogether unaccountable distinctness. The entire absence of the ocean or sea, and indeed of any lake or river, or body of water whatsoever, struck me at first glance as the most extraordinary feature of its geological conditions. Yet, strange to say, I beheld vast extraordinary feature in its geological. I beheld vast level regions of a character decidedly alluvial, although by far the greater portion of the hemisphere in sight was covered by innumerable volcanic mountains, conical in shape and having more the appearance of artificial than of natural protuberances. The highest among them does not exceed 3 3/4 miles in perpendicular elevation, but a map of the volcanic districts of the Campi Flegrei would afford to your excellencies a better idea of the general source than any unworthy description I might think better proper to attempt. The greater part of them were in a state of evident eruption, and gave me fear to understand their fury and their power by the repeated thunders of the miscalled meteoric stones, which now rushed upward by the balloon with a frequency more and more appalling. April 18th. Today I found an enormous increase in the moon's apparent bulk, and evidently accelerated velocity to my descent began to fill me with alarm. It will be remembered that in the earliest stage of my speculations upon the possibility of a passage of the moon, the existence in its vicinity of an atmosphere dense in its proportion to the bulk of the planet had entered largely into the my calculations. This too, in spite of the many theories to the contrary, and it may be added, in spite of the general disbelief in the existence of any lunar atmosphere at all. But in addition to what I've already urged in regard to Encke's comet and the zodiacal light, I have been strengthened in my opinion by certain observations of Mr. Schroeder of Lilienthal. He observed that the moon, when 2 days and a half old, in the evening soon after sunset, before the dark part was visible, and continued to watch it until it became visible. The two cusps appeared tapering in a very sharp, faint prolongation, each exhibiting its farthest extremity faintly illuminated by the solar rays, before any part of the dark hemisphere was visible. Soon afterward, the whole dark limb became illuminated. This prolongation of the cusp beyond the semicircle, I thought, must have arisen from the retraction of the sun's rays by the moon's atmosphere. I computed, although the height of the atmosphere, which could refract light enough into its dark hemisphere to produce a twilight more luminous than the light reflected from the Earth when the moon is about 32 degrees from the new, to be 1,356 Paris feet in this view. I suppose the greatest height capable of refracting by a passage in the 82nd volume of the Philosophical Transactions is, which it is to be stated, that at an occultation of Jupiter's satellites, the third disappeared after having been about 1 inch to 2 inches of time indistinct, and the fourth became indiscernible in the limb. Upon the resistance of a more properly, or upon the support of an atmosphere existing in the state of more density imagined, I had, of course, entirely depended for the safety of my ultimate descent. Should I then, after all, prove to have been mistaken, I had, in consequence, nothing better to expect. As a finale to my adventure, than being dashed into atoms against the market surface satellite. And indeed, I had now every reason to be terrified. My distance from the moon was comparatively trifling, and while the labor required by my condenser was diminished not at all, I could discover no indication whatever of a decreasing rarity in the air. April 19th. This morning, to my great joy, about 9 o'clock, the surface of the moon being frightfully near, and my apprehensions excited to the utmost, the pump of my condenser at length gave evident tokens of an alteration in the atmosphere. By 10, I had reason to believe its density considerably increased. By 11, very little labor was necessary at the apparatus. And at 12 o'clock, with some hesitation, I ventured to unscrew the tourniquet. When finding no inconvenience from having done so, I finally threw open the gum elastic chamber and unrigged it from around the car. As might have been expected, spasms and violent headache were the immediate consequences of an experiment so precipitate and full of danger. But these are other difficulties attending respiration, as they were by no means so great as to put me in peril of my life. I determined to endure as best I could, in consideration of my leaving them behind momentarily in my approach to the denser strata near the moon. This approach, however, was still impetuous in the extreme, and it soon became alarmingly certain that although I had probably not been deceived in the expectation of the atmosphere dense in proportion to the mass of the satellite, still I had been wrong in supposing this density, even at the surface, at all adequate to support of the great weight contained in the car of my balloon. Yet this should have been the case, and in an equal degree as at the surface of the Earth, the actual gravities of body were at either planet supposed in the ratio of the atmospheric condensation. That it was not the case, however, my precipitate downfall gave testimony enough. Why it was not so, can only be explained by a reference to those possible geological disturbances to which I have formerly alluded. At all events, I was now close upon the planet, and I was coming down with the most terrible impetuosity. I lost not a moment. Accordingly, in throwing overboard first my ballast and my water kegs, then my condensing apparatus and my gum chamber, and finally every article within the car. But it was all to no purpose. I still fell with horrible rapidity, and was now not more than half a mile from the surface. As a last resource, therefore, having got rid of my coat, hat, and boots, I cut loose from the balloon of the car itself, which was of no inconsiderable weight, and thus, clinging with both hands to the network, I had barely time to observe that whole country that, as far as the eye could reach, was thickly interspersed with diminutive habitations, ere I tumbled headlong into the very heart of a fantastical-looking city, and in the middle of a vast crowd of ugly little people, who none of them uttered a single syllable, gave themselves the least trouble to render me assistance, but stood like a parcel of idiots, grinning in a ludicrous manner, and eyeing me and my balloon askant, with their arms set akimbo. I turned from them in contempt, and gazing upward at the earth so lately left, and left perhaps forever, beheld it like a huge dull copper shield, about 2 degrees in diameter, fixed immovably in the heavens overhead, and tipped over one of the edges like with a crescent border of the most brilliant gold. No traces of land or water could be discovered, and the whole was clouded with invariable spots, and belted with tropical and equatorial zones. Thus may it please your excellencies, after a series of great anxieties, unheard of dangers, and unparalleled escapes, I had at length, on the 19th day of my departure from Rotterdam, arrived in safety at the conclusion of a voyage, undoubtedly the most extraordinary and the most momentous ever accomplished, undertaken or conceived by any denizen of earth. But my adventures yet still remained to be related. And indeed, your excellencies may well imagine that after a residence of 5 years upon a planet not only deeply interesting in its own peculiar character, but rendered doubly so by its intimate connection and capacity of a satellite with the whole world inhabited by man, I may have intelligence for the private ear of a States College of Astronomers of far more importance than the details, however wonderful, of the mere voyage which so happily concluded. This is in fact the case. I have much, very much, which it would give the greatest pleasure to communicate. I have much to say of the climate of the planet, of its wonderful alternations of heat and cold, of unmitigated, unburning sunshine for 1 fortnight, and more than polar frigidity for the next, of the constant transfer of moisture by distillation of that of vacuo from the point beneath the sun to the point the farthest from it, of a variable zone of running water, of the people themselves, of the manners and customs of political institutions, of their peculiar physical construction, of their ugliness, of their want of ears, their useless appendages in the atmosphere so peculiarly modified, of their consequent ignorance, of their use and properties of speech, of their substitute for connection, speech in its singular method of intercommunication, of the incomprehensible connection between each particular individual of the moon with some particular individual on Earth, a connection analogous with and depending upon that the orbs of the Earth, of the planet, and the satellite, and by new means of which the lives and destinies of inhabitants of the one are interwoven with the lives and destinies of the inhabitants of the other, And above all, if it please your excellencies, above all of those dark and hideous mysteries which lie in the outer regions of the moon, regions which, owing to the almost miraculous accordance of the satellite's rotation of its own axis, with its sidereal revolution about the earth, have never yet been so turned, and by God's mercy never shall be turned, to the scrutinies of the telescopes of man. All this, and more, much more, would I most willingly detail. But to be brief, I must have my reward. I am pining for a return to my family and to my home, and as the price of any farther communication on my part, in consideration of the light which I have it in my power to throw upon many very important branches of physical and metaphysical science, I must solicit through the influence of their honorable body a pardon for the crime of which I have been guilty in the death of the creditors upon my departure from Rotterdam. This, then, is the object of my present paper. Its bearer, an inhabitant of the moon, whom I have prevailed upon and properly instructed to be my messenger of the earth, will await your excellency's pleasure, and return to me with the pardon in question, if it can, in any manner, be obtained. I have the honor to be, etc., your excellency's very humble servant, Pfaall. Upon finishing the perusal of this very extraordinary document, Professor Rub-a-Dub, it is said, dropped his pipe upon the ground in extremity of his surprise, and mine here superbus superbus von Underduck, having taken off his spectacles, wiped them and deposited them in his pocket, so far forgot both himself and his dignity as to turn around 3 times upon his heel in the quintessence of the astonishment and admiration. There was no doubt about the matter. The pardon should be obtained. So at least swore with a round oath Professor Rub-a-Dub, and so finally thought the illustrious von Underduck, as he took the arm of his brother in science, and without saying a word, began to make the best of his way home, and to deliberate upon the measures to be adopted. Having reached the door, however, of the burgomaster's dwelling, the professor ventured to suggest that, as the messenger had thought proper to disappear, no doubt frightened to the death by the savage appearance of the burghers of Rotterdam, the pardon would be of little use, as no one but a man of the moon would undertake a voyage so vast a distance. To the truth of this observation the burgomaster assented, and the matter was therefore an end. Not so, however, rumors and speculations. The letter, having been published, gave rise to a variety of gossip and opinion. Some of the overwise even made themselves ridiculous by decrying the whole business as nothing better than a hoax. But hoax with these sort of people is, I believe, a general term of matters above their comprehension. For my part, I cannot conceive upon what data they have founded such an accusation. Let me see what they say. And primus, that certain wags in Rotterdam have certain especial antipathies to certain burgomasters and astronomers. Secondly, that an odd little dwarf and bottle conjurer, both of whose ears, for some misdemeanor, having been cut off close to his head, has been missing for several days from the neighboring city of Bruges. Thirdly, that the newspapers, which were struck all over by the little bloom were newspapers of Holland, and therefore could not have been made of the moon. They were dirty papers, very dirty, and Gluck, the printer, would take his Bible oath to their having been printed in Rotterdam. Fourthly, that Hans Pfaall himself, the drunken villain, and three very idle gentlemen styled his creditors, were all seen no longer than 2 or 3 days ago in a tippling house in the suburbs, having just returned with money in their pockets from a trip beyond the sea. Lastly, that is an opinion very generally received, or which ought to be generally received, that the College of Astronomers in the city of Rotterdam, as well as other colleges in all over parts of the world, not to mention colleges and astronomers in general, are, to say the least of the matter, not a whit better nor greater nor wiser than they ought to be.